So we are going to look at doing EQ and mixing drums for a particular song in Pro Tools. So for today, we are looking at a track. It's called Let Me Guess. It's drums only. So as you notice, we have a kick, we have a snare, we have a hi-hat. We have some high toms and low toms that are already edited out, and we have an overhead left and an overhead right. Okay, so some pretty good drums there. So when we do this mix, we're actually going to be doing the mix in the view of the mix window, which is going to look a little bit more like an audio console from here. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to take all of these tracks and we're going to bring them down. Okay, we do not want to have all the tracks at 0 when we start mixing, except for the master fader. The master fader we are not going to touch at all. Okay, we usually never touch that. We sometimes add in some effects and plugins, but we never really touch the fader because we want that to be at 0. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to try to figure out where in the overheads the perspective is coming from. So are we in drummer's perspective or are we in audience perspective? So in drummer's perspective, we would see the hi-hat on the left-hand side because that's how you would be playing the drums. If you were in audience perspective, we would see the hi-hat on the right-hand side because, again, that's how the drummer would play the drums. So where we see that hi-hat in this stereo field is going to determine where we're going to put the hi-hat and all the other toms and drums in the regular mix. So first thing we're going to do is overhead left, overhead right. Again, that doesn't really matter. We don't know if it's drummer's perspective or audience perspective. So I'm just going to kind of follow what they say. I'm going to solo these tracks, and then I'm going to bring these up to about 0 again. In order to sort of snap that there, we can just click on that and get them to 0, and that's fine. So if we hit play, we're noticing that the ride is on the right-hand side. There it is. So let's get to a part that has only hi-hat. And that hi-hat is going to be on the left-hand side. You can already hear that it's on your left speaker. There it is. Okay, so that's going to give us a good picture of what the entire drum set sounds like. Now, we can take it out of solo. We're going to keep the overhead left and the overhead right exactly where they are. We're noticing that our master fader, everything is looking good so far, so that's good. Okay, next thing we're going to do is we're going to bring that kick up until it just supports the overheads. Okay, there you go. So it's supporting the overheads now. It's not overpowering it. If we put it too high, then we would just be hearing kick drum. We would not be hearing the kick drum from the overheads. Again, what we want to do is we want to just support the overheads with this spot mic. There we go. Okay, we're going to do the same thing with the snare drum, only we're going to mute the kick drum this time because we just want to hear it, the snare drum inside of the overheads. Right there. Nice. Okay. We're going to do the same thing with the hi-hats. But now with the hi-hats, we're actually going to bring them up a tiny bit, a little bit higher than we normally would, and we're going to pan this right and left in order for it to find the spot where it's going to land in the overhead. So for example, if the hi-hat in the overheads is right about here on the left-hand side, well, we don't know where exactly that particular hi-hat is going to land, so we can't just kind of put it here because we don't know. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to find that exact spot by going back and forth until we can hear in our headphones or in our speakers that the hi-hat is now matching up with the overhead. So for example, here's the hi-hat. On the right-hand side. But we hear in the overheads it's on the left-hand side, so we'll sweep that to the left. Until it about matches, and when they go too far, now I'm hearing two hi-hats. And that's kind of doubling the volume, so that's what we want right there, okay? And same thing, now I'm going to bring it down and all the way back up until it supports. You're going to notice you don't need much hi-hat. Awesome. Okay, so same thing with the tom. We're going to just try to find a spot now where the toms are playing often. So I'm just going to highlight this particular clip so we can hear exactly where they're coming from. And I'm just going to loop my playback by going to Options, Loop Playback, so that we're just constantly listening to that spot. Okay, same thing, going to bring that high tom up. Not there. So there's my high tom right there. There we go. So that high tom is actually right of center, which means that the tom was actually put more towards the right and with the low tom, or I should say adjusted towards the low tom. Yeah, that sounds better. Okay, great. Now let's find that low tom, which I'm expecting to be pretty far to the right-hand side. Here's your low tom. Zoom in a little bit more. There we go. Now that's supporting it pretty well. And if you're noticing, my gain staging is actually looking really good right now. Nothing is really clipping, except when I was going a little too far forward. So now I'm going to unmute everything, and we're going to see how this whole entire mix sounds together. How's that mix? Okay, so there we go. That's pretty much your basic mix of your drums, right? We always mix towards the overheads with live drums versus bringing up the spot mic and then trying to match the overheads to those. So this gives you a better and true picture of the sound of the particular overhead or particular acoustic drums, right? Now this is going to be completely different depending on what drum set you actually use, so that's why I'm showing you this method of just going through, bringing up the track slowly, and then trying to find it in the stereo spectrum, because you'll hear it match right up, right? You'll either get a doubling of the volume or you'll sort of hear it pop through the mix a little bit more, right? And if you notice, none of my tracks are going really past zero except for maybe that snare, and it might have been recorded a little bit softer. But everything else is below zero, and we're still getting a really strong mix on the master, right? So that's exactly what we want. This is called proper gain staging. Now, for your EQ portion, this is going to throw the mix off. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to plugins, We're going to go to EQ, and I'm going to use the 7-band EQ for right now, just because it's going to give us more options for what we're going to want to do with this. Okay, so 7-band EQ means that we have 2 filters. We have a high-pass filter and a low-pass filter that we can work with. And then we have 5 bands of equalization. Now, for this particular plugin, we can turn these bands off, which just saves a little bit of processing power. That's not really necessary, but I like to kind of turn it off. And then we have a few different options on the low frequency and the high frequency EQs. Okay, this one right here, if we put this in, is going to be more of like a shelving EQ, where it's going to affect all the frequencies below it and above it that way, versus a parametric EQ, which is this circle right here, which gives you a lot more finer control. Okay, and this is the ones we're going to be using the most, is the parametric EQs. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is I'm going to do a search and rescue method on this particular kick drum, and what I want to do is I want to hear what is actually in this kick drum, and I'm going to use these 5 frequencies to determine if I want to keep those or let them go. So here's my kick drum. I'm just going to jack this frequency all the way up. Okay, so there's something there, but now I need to shorten my cue so I can find exactly where that is. You hear how it's starting to distort there, and it's becoming really present. So that means that there's something interesting right at that particular point at 57 Hertz. Okay, so I'm just going to turn that off and know that 57 Hertz is going to be something that I want to check out a little bit later. I'm going to go a little bit further now. So there's my 57 Hertz. Okay, right around here there's something interesting too. So I'm just going to turn that off, find something else. Okay, so there's something like really boxy right there about that sound. Not sure if I want to keep that, but I'm just going to keep that frequency locked in so I know if I want to do anything with it. Continue on. Okay, so there's something interesting here around 1.5 Hertz or 1,500 Hertz. And let's see if we can't find that beater happening at the top. So that beater is the actual kick pedal beater hitting into the drum head. And we can hear that it's becoming a little bit snappy. And a lot of drums have that little snappy part. That's kind of what we want to keep. It's usually around 4K. Go. Let's see. Start this. There it is. A little bit less. Awesome. There it is. Okay, so I have 5 different spots where I need to decide if I want to keep those frequencies or remove them. Okay, so I really like the beater. I'm going to keep that, but now I'm not going to gain it as much, right? We're only going to work in 3 dB increments of gain. And that's really all we need. Even though it looks tiny over here, remember 3 dB is a doubling or a halving of the signal. So if we increase by 3 dB, we're actually doubling the amount of volume. If we decrease by 3 dB, we're actually reducing the volume in half. If we reduce by 6 dB, that's a half of a half. Okay, so that's how that works. So I'm just going to use 3 dB or so around that beater. I really don't like that sound, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove it, okay? I don't think it's really necessary. I don't like that boxy sound either, so I'm just going to remove it as well. And we can already hear that the kick drum is becoming a little bit more present, right? I don't mind that. It's giving a little bit of a higher thump, so I'm just going to increase that by, say, 1.5 dB, so it's not as much. And there's my thud, right? So I like that thud. I'm not going to increase it by much. there it is. So without the EQ, with the EQ, it gives it a much tighter type of kick drum sound. Now, as I'm noticing, I'm just keeping a little bit up here, down here and up here, and I'm kind of removing most of the middle. So I kind of don't like any of this stuff right over here. I can actually take this EQ and just open it up more. And maybe just get rid of this one and just remove most of the middle of this kick drum. I just don't need it. Maybe not be as aggressive. There we go. That's a much tighter kick drum sound. So without, with. Now adding it back into the mix, we should hear it pop through a little bit more. And I'm going to give it just a little bit more beater. Oh yeah, there it is. Much tighter. Okay, so let's take a look at that snare now. So we're going to go back to the EQ7, solo that snare. So let's try to find some interesting parts of that snare. Turn these off. Raise that Q a little bit. Thump right there. Just going to take that down a little bit so we know where the thump is. Let's find another interesting part of that snare. Oh, okay, so we're going to find a little bit of a ring in this snare. So same thing, we're going to boost it until we find exactly where that ring is. Let's find a better part of this snare. So there's a little bit of the smack. Looks like we found the ring, so basically I'll just get rid of it now. So that gets rid of the ring. So we are missing a little bit of the smack of the sound, but that's okay. If we want to add a little bit back in, we can just kind of add it around that area. All right, let's find some more stuff going on in here. So let's turn that off. So now we're looking for the snappy part of the sound. Looks like right around there, and then we want to try to find something else interesting, maybe try to get the snares. Looks like we're pretty close. Okay, so right around this area. I'd say right around this area right here. I'm going to open up the Q a little bit. It's going to bring a little snap to it. Okay, so now we can actually include all of these interesting finds in here, and we notice that we have a pretty good EQ curve for this particular snare. So this one and this one are pretty much doing the same exact thing, so I might actually just get rid of that mid-range frequency, and I might just open up the Q a little bit more just to save a little bit of processing on that. I'm only going to increase that by, like, say 4 dB. That gets that low end to that snare. It gives it a little bit more bottom. So far my gain staging is doing pretty good over here. Let's see what's going on with this frequency. Now let's see if we can't get a little bit more snap. I'm going to open it up so that it just affects a little more frequencies. Good. And then that snap, it's giving it a little bit more life too. I'm going to actually increase that to like 5 or 6 dB. Makes that high end of the snare just come out. So here's the snare with no EQ. with EQ. Great. Now we'll listen to it, the whole mix. Sounding good. All right, let's move on to high tom. Okay, so working on this high tom, this is sort of the EQ curve that I came up with. So I'm just going to remove all of these and kind of show you how that EQ curve came about. So if we're listening to that high tom, I'll put one of these in there for right now. Actually, I'm going to put this over. All right, so if we were to boost this up, we would notice that there's something really interesting happening at that frequency right there. There's that low punch to it, right? So I'm going to kind of keep that there. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to look for that other sort of low punch, which kind of gives it that classic tom sound right there. And that's the frequency that I found, so I'm just going to remove it. Or excuse me, bring it down a little bit to about 3 dB. Now in here, there's just a lot of boxy emptiness that we kind of don't need from a tom, right? So we're just going to bring it down just like we did with the kick drum, right? We kind of don't need any of that stuff in here. And up here is the actual click hit of the stick. So if we keep that, we remove this, we remove this, get a nice tight high tom now. Nothing with EQ. And it's going to fit in a lot better. And I might even now need to bring up that high tom. There we go. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to do the same exact thing on the low tom. So if I solo that low tom, let's find a spot where we actually have the low tom. I'm going to find some of that interesting stuff. Oh, there it is. Wow, found it right away. Okay, so that's your low part of the tom. Let's find something else. Cool. Yep, so there's something else. Let's find this other middle stuff. It's kind of that boxiness that we kind of just don't need, so I'm just going to remove that again. So that's kind of more the stick hit, right? Let's bring that right about here. Let's add that. Let's add that. Now, these are kind of close together, so what I might actually do is I might just kind of cut and split the difference and then open up the Q so it's just a little bit more natural. I want that tom to be a little clickier. And it might not be enough clickiness just because of the way that the drum might have hit the drum with the mallet or the stick. So that actually sounds pretty good. So without any EQ, it's kind of a dead tom. Kind of gives it a little bit more life, adding it together. Just kind of listen to that area. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the overheads. The overheads are going to be treated just a little bit differently, right? With those overheads, we don't need any real low-end stuff because we're getting that taken care of with the kick and the highs and low tom. So what I would actually do for the overheads is I would actually put in a little bit of a filter. It's going to not sound great separately, but with the whole entire drum kit, it's going to sound really, really good. So what I would actually do is I would actually get rid of a lot of the low frequencies, and I might even put this at, say, like 300 hertz, just because I don't want to really get too much of the low frequencies within this drum. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply use that shelving EQ now and just try to get some more of the interesting stuff out of the cymbals. Because really that's what the overhead is looking at. It's looking at the cymbals, right? So I kind of like where this EQ is right now. It's a little bit lo-fi, so to speak, but once we add it to the rest of the drums, it's going to sound really good. So all I'm going to do is I'm now going to just drag this whole entire plugin over by holding the option key, and it's just going to copy it. So if I click on one, I click on the other, there's my EQ curve for the left and the right overheads. Okay? Now it's going to give a much snappier overhead. So if I add this all together, I'm noticing my kick drum is just a little bit too loud now. And now we have a really, really clear drum sound. Okay, without EQ, I'm just going to turn this off. Okay, it's a little uncontrolled right now, but now once we start adding these in, those cymbals are really going to punch through, and each drum is now going to sound very, 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 very clear. And if you notice, my master fader wasn't clipping it at all, right? So the only track that's actually going a little above 0 is the snare, and that's okay because it was recorded a little bit low. But now my gain staging is actually really, really, really good, right? I'm not clipping in the master fader, and the rest of my drums are all well within limits, and we can, if we need to, we can boost them a lot later. But as for right now, this is a pretty solid drum mix, okay? So just to reiterate what we did, one is we got a really basic drum mix by pulling down all of the faders except for the master fader, keeping it at 0. 2, we raised them until they supported the overheads. Okay. 3, on the spot mics, what we did was we boosted them up until we found where they sat within the panning and the stereo spectrum of those overheads. So then we brought them down and brought them back up in order to support them. 4, we did the search and rescue method on the EQs for each individual drum. And there we go. Okay. For the hi-hat, we really didn't need too much EQ on that. That hi-hat sounded pretty good. But if I was to go through, I would treat that hi-hat very similar to what I might do with the overheads, right? So depending on what you want your hi-hats to sound like, if you want that kind of trashy sound, trash can-ish type sound, I might do something like that's more of a ride. So let's find a good spot for this. Okay, so depending on what you want your hi-hats to sound like. Okay, so that's kind of a trash canny sound. You're hitting some trash cans. Or if you want them to sound a little bit more brittle, kind of boost around here. Okay, and that's pretty much all you need. The hi-hats are really going to come through the overheads, so I might do something like that for the hi-hats. I'm not going to spend too much time on them. And I'll just bring them down in the mix. There we go. So that's your pretty standard mix on your drums, okay? So after this, I would go through and add some compression. I would probably group these and then finally put them back into the full mix. Okay, so that's how you do your basic drums, basic live drums with a good overhead picture and spot mics.